The vampire king intercepted a child's frantic 911 call when she couldn't wake her mother. His fingers froze over the disconnect button. But the little girl's voice carried a familiar lullaby melody his dead wife used to hum, and 3 centuries of grief cracked open in a single breath. The glass towers of downtown stretched into the winter night like frozen sentinels, their windows reflecting the pulse of emergency lights far below. Kieran Blackthorne pressed his palm against the cold surface of his penthouse surveillance room, watching the city breathe through 1,000 electronic eyes. 3 centuries of monitoring human suffering had taught him to filter the noise, to let the endless stream of 911 calls wash over him like distant rain. His fingers moved across the control panel with mechanical precision, routing genuine emergencies to human dispatch, while his ancient network intercepted anything that carried the metallic scent of supernatural involvement. The routine had become meditation, a way to feel connected to the mortal world without risking the vulnerability that had once destroyed him. Tonight felt different. The air carried a charge that made his enhanced senses prickle with unease. Static crackled through the speakers as a new call patched through, and a small voice cut through the electronic hum like a blade through silk. Kieran's hand froze halfway to the disconnect switch. The child was crying, her words broken by hiccups and fear, but between the sobs, she hummed something that made his dead heart stutter back to life. Note by note, the melody unwound 300 years of carefully constructed emotional armor. It was impossible. No one living knew that song. His enhanced hearing caught every tremor in the little girl's voice as she whispered into the phone, and the tune she hummed to comfort herself was the same lullaby Serafina had sung during their brief, burning years together. The vampire king's fingers trembled against the control panel as memory crashed through his defenses like water through a broken dam. The surveillance room disappeared, replaced by flickering candlelight and the scent of herbs. Serafina lay in their marriage bed, her dark hair spread across white pillows, one hand pressed to her swollen belly while the other clutched his with desperate strength. The midwife had shaken her head hours ago, but Serafina refused to surrender. She hummed that melody between contractions, her voice growing weaker but never stopping, as if the song itself could hold her to life long enough to see their child born. Kieran had knelt beside her, his supernatural strength useless against the simple mortality that was stealing her away, breath by breath. When the music finally stopped, it took his soul with it. He had buried the melody so deep that centuries of existence couldn't touch it. Yet now it poured from the speakers with the innocent clarity of a terrified child. The present reasserted itself with brutal force. The little girl was still talking to the empty line, her voice small and lost. She couldn't be more than 6 years old, and she was trying to explain to an operator who would never answer that her mommy wouldn't wake up no matter how hard she shook her. Kieran's enhanced senses reached through the electronic connection, tasting the electromagnetic signature that surrounded every call. This one carried traces of something older than technology, something that recognized bloodlines and ancient promises. His network had intercepted the transmission, not because of random chance, but because the child calling carried markers in her voice that sang to protocols written in blood and starlight. He traced the signal through fiber optic cables and cell towers, his consciousness flowing through the digital infrastructure of the city, like water finding its level. The call originated from an apartment building on the east side, 12 stories of faded brick and broken dreams. Through traffic cameras and security feeds, he watched the building's entrance, noting the lack of emergency vehicles. The call hadn't reached human authorities. His network had claimed it first, drawn by something in the child's lineage that spoke to magic older than the city itself. Kieran pulled up building records with supernatural efficiency, his fingers dancing across keyboards that responded to thought as much as touch. Luna Ashworth, age 6. Elena Ashworth, age 28, single mother, worked 3 part-time jobs to keep them housed and fed. No father listed on any documents, no extended family, no support network beyond the fragile bonds of human kindness. They were alone in the way that made mortals vulnerable to the predators who hunted in shadow. But there was something else, something that made Kieran's ancient instincts scream warnings into the night. Through the apartment building's security system, he detected a second heartbeat in their unit, too slow and too irregular to be healthy human rhythm. Elena Ashworth wasn't sleeping. She was dying. The Vampire King's network spread through the city like a spider's web, invisible threads of influence that touched every emergency service and government database. Within minutes, he had activated protocols that had been dormant for decades. Dr. Evelyn Cross received an anonymous tip through channels that couldn't be traced, a message that appeared on her secure hospital communication system as if it had always been there. Child in distress, apartment 7B at 1247 East Meridian, possible medical emergency, respond immediately. She was one of the few mortals in the city who could be trusted with genuine supernatural crises, though she had never realized why certain cases seemed to find their way to her attention. Her reputation for discretion and her instinctive protectiveness toward children made her invaluable to creatures who needed human allies but couldn't risk exposure. As Kieran watched Dr. Cross gather her emergency kit and head for the address, he felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. 3 centuries ago, he had withdrawn from the mortal world after losing Seraphina and their unborn child. The grief had driven him to embrace the darkness that vampirism offered, trading emotion for immortal emptiness. He had built his surveillance network not out of altruism, but from a need to observe life without participating in it, to touch the warmth of human existence without risking the pain of loss. Now a child who sang his dead wife's lullaby was calling for help, and her mother lay dying of something that carried supernatural fingerprints. Every instinct he had developed over centuries of careful isolation screamed at him to disconnect the call, to let human authorities handle whatever tragedy was unfolding in that modest apartment. But Luna's voice continued to whisper through the speakers, and between her frightened words, she hummed that impossible melody, the one that had died with Seraphina, but somehow lived on in the throat of a terrified child. The apartment building's security cameras showed Dr. Cross arriving, her medical bag in hand and determination etched in every line of her posture. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had seen too much human suffering to waste time on hesitation. As she approached apartment 7B, Kieran made his choice. He couldn't abandon the child who sang Seraphina's song, no matter what the cost to his carefully maintained isolation. The Vampire King began to move, his enhanced speed carrying him through the penthouse and toward the elevator that would take him down into the mortal world he had avoided for 300 years. Behind him, the surveillance monitors continued their endless watch, but for the first time in centuries, Kieran Blackthorne was stepping out of the shadows to protect something precious rather than simply observe its destruction. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Dr. Evelyn Cross climbed the narrow stairs of the apartment building, her medical bag weighing heavier with each step as the anonymous tip echoed in her mind. 20 years of pediatric emergency medicine had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this call felt different from the routine domestic crises that usually found their way to her attention. The hallway on the 7th floor smelled of cooking spices and old carpet, the kind of building where working families scraped together rent payments and hoped for better days. Apartment 7B sat at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar as if someone had been waiting for her arrival. She knocked gently and pushed the door open, calling out in the soft voice she reserved for frightened children. What she found inside made her medical training kick into high gear, even as her heart broke at the sight. A little girl with dark curls and enormous brown eyes sat cross-legged beside a woman sprawled unconscious on the living room floor. The child looked up at Dr. Cross with a composure that seemed impossible for someone so young, and as their eyes met, she began to sing in a clear, sweet voice that carried an ancient melody. The lullaby was hauntingly beautiful, but it was the calm way the child sang it that sent chills down Dr. Cross's spine. This was not the behavior of a traumatized 6-year-old. This was something else entirely. Dr. Cross knelt beside the unconscious woman, her trained hands immediately checking for vital signs, while her mind catalogued the scene. Elena Ashworth was breathing, but her pulse was weak and irregular, her skin pale with an unhealthy translucent quality that suggested significant blood loss. As Dr. Cross gently tilted the woman's head to check her airways, she saw them. 2 small puncture wounds on Elena's neck, perfectly spaced and surrounded by tissue that should have been healing, but instead seemed frozen in a state of suspended animation. The wounds were too precise to be accidental, too clean to be from any animal attack, and the way they refused to close despite obvious medical attention suggested something far outside the realm of normal medicine. The little girl continued singing, her voice never wavering even as she watched Dr. Cross examine her mother with professional efficiency. There was something unsettling about the child's composure, as if she understood far more about their situation than any 6-year-old should. When Dr. Cross asked her name, the girl replied clearly that she was Luna and that her mommy had been sleeping for 2 days now, ever since the pale man visited. She described him with the matter-of-fact precision of childhood observation, mentioning his cold hands and the way he smelled like old roses and metal. As Dr. Cross worked to stabilize Elena for transport, she became aware of being watched. The sensation crawled up her spine like ice water, the unmistakable feeling of predatory attention focused on her every movement. Through the apartment's single window, she caught glimpses of movement in the alley below, shadows that seemed to shift independently of the streetlights. Something was circling them, and whatever it was had been patient enough to wait until medical help arrived before making its presence known. From his vantage point in the alley, Kieran Blackthorne felt the world tilt on its axis as he looked through the apartment window. The woman lying unconscious on the floor was Serafina. Not similar to her, not reminiscent of her, but identical in every detail that mattered. The same delicate bone structure, the same sweep of dark hair, the same small birthmark on her left wrist that had fascinated him during their brief mortal marriage. Even unconscious and drained by supernatural poison, Elena Ashworth carried herself with the same grace that had first captured his attention 3 centuries ago. It was impossible, yet the evidence lay before him like a resurrection. As Dr. Cross worked over Elena's prone form, Kieran's enhanced vision catalogued every detail of the scene above. The puncture wounds on Elena's neck told a story of vampire involvement, but the technique was wrong, sloppy in a way that spoke of desperation rather than skill. Someone had fed from her, but without the precision that would ensure clean healing. The wounds festered with supernatural poison, designed not to turn her, but to keep her suspended between life and death, while her blood was slowly drained. This was torture disguised as feeding, a method Kieran had seen employed by vampires who wanted their victims to suffer before dying. The child, Luna, continued her impossible song, and each note confirmed what Kieran's heart already knew, but his mind refused to accept. Only Serafina's bloodline could carry that melody with such perfection, could sing it with the unconscious knowledge of its true meaning. The lullaby wasn't just a song, but a protection spell, woven into music by Serafina's own mother generations before vampires walked openly in the world. It was designed to calm supernatural creatures, to remind them of their lost humanity, and stay their hand from violence. That Luna could sing it without training meant the knowledge lived in her blood, passed down through maternal lines like a genetic memory. Kieran retreated to his penthouse and activated research protocols that had been dormant for decades. His supernatural network reached into archives both digital and arcane, tracing bloodlines through marriage records and birth certificates, through convent records and adoption papers, through the careful genealogical work that only immortal creatures had the patience to maintain. The truth unfolded like a map drawn in blood and sorrow. Seraphina's child had lived. Somehow, impossibly, the daughter she carried when she died had been born and spirited away to safety. The records were fragmentary and deliberately obscured, but they told a story of midnight flights and desperate nuns who understood that some children were born with targets on their backs. The infant had been raised in a series of convents, her supernatural heritage carefully hidden beneath layers of Catholic doctrine and protective ritual. She had grown up believing herself perfectly human, had married and divorced, and eventually given birth to Luna, without ever knowing that her bloodline carried power that vampires would kill to possess. Elena was Seraphina's great-great-granddaughter, the living continuation of a line Kieran had thought ended with his wife's death. The blood magic that made Seraphina special had strengthened over the generations, concentrating itself until Luna carried markers that would shine like a beacon to any vampire with the knowledge to recognize them. She was what the old texts called an anchor, a human whose blood could bind vampire souls to their mortal emotions, could force them to remember what they had been before the hunger consumed them. It was a gift and a curse, for while anchor blood could heal the spiritual wounds that immortality inflicted, it was also sought after by vampires who wanted to harness that power for darker purposes. As Kieran processed this revelation, his surveillance network detected new movement in the city. Marcus Voss was on the hunt. The rival vampire lord had been Kieran's enemy for over 2 centuries, ever since a territorial dispute had ended, with Marcus's progeny destroyed and his power base shattered. Marcus had spent the intervening years rebuilding his strength and nursing his hatred, waiting for an opportunity to strike at Kieran where it would hurt most. Somehow, he had discovered Seraphina's surviving bloodline before Kieran had, and he was using Elena as bait to draw the vampire king out of his protective isolation. Marcus's plan was elegant in its cruelty. By slowly draining Elena with supernatural poison, he kept her alive long enough for her distress to trigger Kieran's ancient protective protocols. The child's 911 call had been intended to reach Kieran's network, to force him into a choice between maintaining his emotional distance and saving the echo of his lost love. Marcus knew that Kieran's legendary strategic mind came from his ability to maintain emotional equilibrium even in crisis, and he believed that consuming Elena's anchor blood while she was bonded to Kieran through supernatural connection would transfer that ability to himself. It was a theory born from desperate ambition rather than solid magical knowledge, but it was dangerous enough to justify the elaborate trap he had constructed. Luna continued to demonstrate abilities that should have been impossible for someone so young. She hummed the protective lullaby whenever supernatural presences drew near, her instincts warning her of dangers she couldn't consciously understand. When Dr. Cross prepared the ambulance for transport, Luna insisted on riding along, claiming that her mommy would be scared if she woke up alone. But Kieran's enhanced hearing caught the real reason in the child's whispered words to her unconscious mother. Luna could sense that something was hunting them, and she knew somehow that staying together was their only protection. As the ambulance pulled away from the apartment building, Kieran felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. He had sworn after Seraphina's death that he would never again allow himself to become vulnerable through emotional attachment. The pain of loss had nearly destroyed him, and only by embracing the cold efficiency of vampiric nature had he survived the grief that threatened to consume him entirely. Now Elena lay dying of supernatural poison, while her daughter sang songs that should have died with their ancestor, and Kieran faced a choice that would define the next phase of his immortal existence. He could retreat back to his surveillance tower and let fate take its course, preserving the emotional equilibrium that had become his greatest strength. Or he could step fully into the light and risk everything to save two mortals who carried the genetic echo of his greatest love and deepest loss. Marcus Voss was counting on sentiment to make the vampire king vulnerable, and perhaps he was right. But as Luna's lullaby drifted through the night air like a prayer made audible, Kieran began to suspect that some things were worth the risk of vulnerability, and some loves transcended even the fear of loss. The ambulance screamed through the night streets toward Mercy General Hospital, its red and blue lights painting the darkness in urgent colors, while Dr. Cross worked to stabilize Elena's deteriorating condition. Inside the vehicle, Luna sat perfectly still beside her mother's stretcher, her small hand resting on Elena's arm, while she continued the ancient lullaby in a voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the wail of sirens. The child's composure remained unnaturally calm, as if she understood on some instinctive level that her mother's life hung in a balance that had nothing to do with conventional medicine. Dr. Cross watched the monitors with growing concern as Elena's vital signs fluctuated in patterns she had never seen before, her blood pressure dropping and rising in rhythms that seemed to follow the cadence of Luna's song rather than any physiological norm. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Cross took charge of Elena's care with the authority that came from 2 decades of emergency medicine, but even her experienced hands trembled as she ordered tests that she knew would reveal nothing useful. The puncture wounds on Elena's neck defied every medical explanation, and the way her blood refused to clot properly suggested toxins that existed in no pharmaceutical database. As Elena was wheeled into the intensive care unit, Luna followed with the determination of someone far older than her 6 years, refusing to be separated from her mother despite the gentle protests of nursing staff. The child seemed to understand that her presence was somehow crucial to her mother's survival, though she couldn't articulate why beyond insisting that Mommy needed to hear the pretty song. Dr. Cross arranged for Luna to stay in a family consultation room adjacent to the ICU, close enough to see her mother, but out of the way of medical procedures. The hospital settled into its midnight routine of whispered conversations and soft-soled shoes on linoleum floors. But beneath the surface calm, electronic systems began to malfunction in subtle ways that would have concerned any technician paying attention. Security cameras developed blind spots that moved through corridors like living shadows. Electronic locks cycled open and closed without commands, and computer monitors flickered with static that formed patterns too complex to be random interference. Kieran Blackthorne moved through Mercy General Hospital like a ghost made manifest, his supernatural abilities allowing him to slip past human perception, while his centuries of experience with technology bent the building's electronic infrastructure to his will. He had infiltrated countless medical facilities over the decades, usually to monitor potential supernatural incidents or to ensure that certain patients received care beyond what mortal medicine could provide. Tonight felt different. Tonight he moved not as an observer, but as someone with everything to lose, and the weight of that emotional investment made every step feel like walking on broken glass. The ICU occupied the hospital's 7th floor, its windows looking out over the city where Kieran had maintained his isolated vigil for 3 centuries. As he approached Elena's room, he could see her through the observation window, pale and still beneath a web of monitoring equipment that recorded vital signs without understanding their supernatural significance. Her face in unconsciousness was so perfectly identical to Seraphina's that Kieran felt the careful emotional barriers he had constructed over centuries begin to crumble like ancient mortar. The machines surrounding her bed painted electronic portraits of a life hanging by threads that grew more tenuous with each passing hour. The door to Elena's room opened at his approach without the touch of his hand, responding to will rather than physical contact. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and fear couldn't mask the underlying scent that made his enhanced senses recoil. The supernatural poison in Elena's bloodstream carried Marcus Voss's signature like a calling card, a taunt designed to draw Kieran into exactly the position he now occupied. But as he stepped closer to the bed where Elena lay dying, all thoughts of Marcus and his elaborate trap faded into background noise. She was Serafina, and she was dying, and 300 years of careful emotional distance collapsed into a single moment of recognition that felt like resurrection and death combined. Kieran reached toward Elena's face with a hand that had not trembled in centuries, but before his fingers could touch her skin, a small voice spoke from the shadows beside the bed. Luna sat curled in a chair that was too large for her dark eyes fixed on Kieran with an intensity that should have been impossible for someone so young. She showed no fear at his sudden appearance, no surprise that he had materialized in a locked hospital room without using the door. Instead, she studied him with the careful attention of a child trying to solve a puzzle that adults had made unnecessarily complicated. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight of questions that had been building since her mother first fell into her unnatural sleep. She asked if he was the one her mommy dreamed about, the sad man who visited Elena's sleeping mind and made her cry even while unconscious. Luna described dreams that Elena had been having for weeks before Marcus's attack. Visions of a tall figure in dark clothes who watched over her from shadows and spoke her name with a voice full of old sorrow. Elena had dismissed them as stress-induced nightmares, but Luna had listened to her mother talk in her sleep and recognized something in those midnight whispers that spoke to the supernatural awareness growing stronger in her young mind. The innocence of Luna's question hit Kieran like a physical blow, shattering defenses he had thought were impregnable. Here was a child who could see through vampiric concealment that had fooled supernatural creatures far older and more powerful than herself. Speaking of dreams that suggested Elena's anchor bloodline had been reaching across the psychic distance that separated them long before Marcus forced their paths to cross. The implications were staggering. If Elena had been dreaming of him, if their connection predated the crisis that brought them together, then the bond between them was deeper than mere genetic echo. Luna continued to study Kieran's face as he processed her revelation, and something in his expression must have confirmed her suspicions, because she began to sing the lullaby directly to him. Her clear young voice filled the sterile hospital room with melody that carried power beyond its simple notes, and for the first time in 3 centuries, Kieran felt the ice around his heart begin to crack and melt. The song that Serafina had used to calm their unborn child now flowed from the throat of her descendant, carrying with it the accumulated love and protection of all the mothers who had sung it down through the generations. Luna seemed to understand instinctively that the melody could reach parts of Kieran's soul that centuries of isolation had frozen solid, that it could remind him of who he had been before grief transformed him into something cold and distant. As the lullaby washed over him, Kieran found himself remembering not just Serafina's death, but her life, the warmth of her laughter, and the way she had believed absolutely in his capacity for goodness, even when he doubted it himself. Luna's voice carried those memories like gifts, returning to him pieces of his humanity that he had thought lost forever. But with the return of feeling came the crushing weight of choice. Elena's condition was deteriorating with supernatural speed, the poison in her system designed to keep her alive just long enough to force Kieran into exactly this decision. To save her, he would have to give her his blood, creating a vampiric bond that would tie their lives together for as long as either of them existed. Such a bond between vampire and human was forbidden by the ancient laws that governed supernatural society, punishable by death for both parties. The Vampire Council would hunt them to the ends of the earth, and Luna would be marked for destruction simply by virtue of being Elena's daughter. Yet as Kieran watched Elena's breathing grow more labored and felt Luna's lullaby calling to the parts of his soul he had thought permanently buried, the choice became less about survival and more about whether some things were worth dying for. Marcus had constructed his trap with perfect psychological precision, knowing that Kieran's legendary strategic thinking came from his ability to remain emotionally detached even in crisis. By forcing him to choose between his isolation and his love, Marcus hoped to shatter the equilibrium that made Kieran so formidable. But perhaps Marcus had miscalculated. Perhaps the strength that had sustained Kieran through 3 centuries of immortality came not from emotional distance, but from having once loved so deeply that the memory of it could anchor him through any storm. Luna finished her song and reached out to take Kieran's hand with the fearless trust that only children possessed. Her small fingers were warm against his cold skin, and through that simple contact, he could feel the pulse of anchor blood that made her so precious and so dangerous. She whispered that her mommy needed help from someone who understood the things that normal people couldn't see, and that she had been singing the special song every night since the pale man came because she knew it would call the right person to help them. The child's supernatural intuition had been guiding her actions since the crisis began, and now it told her that Kieran was their protector, even if he didn't look like the kind of hero she had imagined. As Luna spoke of her faith in him, Kieran felt the last of his defenses crumble like castle walls before a siege that had lasted 300 years. The vampire king who had ruled the shadows through careful emotional control was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it meant to love more than life itself. The decision crystallized like water freezing into ice, beautiful and sharp and irreversible. He would save Elena even if it meant war with the Vampire Council. He would protect Luna even if it cost him the immortality he had spent centuries learning to bear. And he would face Marcus Voss not as a calculated strategist, but as someone with everything to lose and nothing left to fear. The ancient council chamber existed in a space between dimensions, accessible only through blood rituals that predated written history, and tonight its obsidian walls pulsed with the rage of creatures who had ruled from shadow for millennia. 12 vampire lords sat in judgment, their faces carved from marble and malice, while reports filtered in through networks that spanned continents and centuries. Kieran Blackthorne had been observed near mortals, not as the distant guardian he had claimed to be for 300 years, but as an active participant in human affairs. The surveillance footage was grainy and deliberately corrupted, but vampire senses could detect the supernatural signature that clung to every frame. Their most powerful member, the king who had maintained perfect emotional control since the death of his human wife, was compromising himself for creatures whose lives flickered out like candle flames in cosmic terms. The eldest of the council, a creature whose name had been forgotten by human history, spoke with a voice like grinding stone. Ancient law was clear on the matter of emotional attachments. Vampires who allowed themselves to become invested in mortal affairs grew weak, unpredictable, dangerous to the careful balance that kept their kind hidden from human awareness. Kieran had been permitted his surveillance network precisely because it maintained distance, allowed him to observe without participating, to protect without caring. Now he was walking among humans, using his powers openly, risking exposure for the sake of a woman and child whose deaths would barely register in the grand sweep of immortal existence. The council's judgment was swift and merciless. Kieran would be brought to account for his actions, and if he could not prove that his emotional stability remained intact, he would face the final sanction. 3 millennia of vampire law had been built on the principle that attachment led to weakness, and weakness in their kind led to discovery by humans who would respond with fire and holy water, and the kind of systematic extermination that had nearly destroyed them once before. Meanwhile, Detective James Reed stood in the hospital parking garage, staring at another malfunctioning security camera, and wondering when his simple missing persons case had turned into something that defied rational explanation. Elena Ashworth had been brought in 3 days ago with symptoms that didn't match any known medical condition, and since then every piece of surveillance equipment within a 5-block radius had begun experiencing systematic failures. The cameras didn't just stop working, they showed footage that couldn't possibly exist. Figures moved through the frames at impossible speeds, casting shadows that fell in directions opposite to the light sources, appearing in one location and instantly materializing in another without crossing the space between. Reed had 30 years of police work behind him, had seen drug deals and domestic violence and murder scenes that would have broken younger officers. But this was different. This felt like something was actively working to keep him from seeing the truth, and his cop instincts were screaming that Elena Ashworth was at the center of something far more dangerous than a simple medical emergency. The detective pulled up the building's electrical schematics on his tablet, noting the pattern of power fluctuations that seemed to follow specific individuals through the hospital corridors. There was Dr. Cross, of course, whose presence registered normal electrical signatures throughout her shifts. But there were other signatures, ones that appeared on monitors for split seconds before the systems crashed, shadows that moved through the building's infrastructure like ghosts in the machine. Reed had requested backup twice, but his superiors were convinced he was chasing phantoms generated by his own imagination and too much overtime. They didn't see what he saw in the corrupted footage, didn't notice that the hospital's emergency system seemed to anticipate crises before they happened, routing resources with supernatural efficiency. In the pediatric intensive care unit, Elena Ashworth thrashed against restraints that the medical staff claimed were necessary for her own protection. But Luna could see that her mother was fighting battles that took place in dreams rather than reality. The child sat beside the hospital bed with the patience of someone far older than her 6 years, humming the protective lullaby that seemed to calm the machines monitoring Elena's vital signs. Dr. Cross had tried multiple times to convince Luna to sleep in the family waiting area, but the girl insisted that her mother needed the song, that without it, the bad dreams would take her away completely. What Dr. Cross couldn't know was that Elena's consciousness was trapped between her own memories and those of her ancestor, that Serafina's final moments were playing out behind her closed eyelids with vivid intensity that made past and present indistinguishable. Elena saw herself giving birth in a candlelit room 3 centuries ago, felt the pain and desperate love that had filled Serafina's final hours, understood with growing horror that she was experiencing the death of a woman she had never known, but whose blood flowed in her veins. In the dream visions, Elena watched Kieran kneel beside Serafina's deathbed, saw the way his supernatural composure cracked as he realized that neither his immortal strength nor his ancient knowledge could save the woman he loved. She felt Serafina's desperate wish that their child would survive, would carry their love forward into a future that neither of them would see. The dreams bled into Elena's waking moments, causing her to call out names that Dr. Cross didn't recognize, to speak in languages that predated modern English, to reach for hands that existed only in genetic memory. Luna heard every word and understood more than any child should. When Dr. Cross asked her about the names her mother kept repeating, Luna replied with unsettling directness that her mommy was remembering the sad man in the dark coat, the one who watched their building from the shadows, and whose presence made the protective song necessary. She described him with the clarity of supernatural perception, mentioning details about his appearance and mannerisms that she couldn't possibly have observed through normal means. Dr. Cross began to suspect that she was dealing with something that existed outside the boundaries of medical science, but her training as a healer overrode her growing fear of the impossible. Marcus Voss had spent decades planning this moment, and now his patience was rewarded with an opportunity that exceeded his most ambitious calculations. He walked through the hospital corridors wearing the stolen identity of Dr. Michael Chen, an infectious disease specialist whose credentials were impeccable and whose real body lay drained of blood in a warehouse across town. The hospital staff accepted his presence without question, vampire glamour ensuring that they saw exactly what he wanted them to see. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Kieran's emotional attachment to Elena and Luna had already been reported to the Vampire Council, ensuring that the king would soon face judgment for his violations of ancient law. But Marcus intended to claim his prize before the council's enforcers could intervene. Elena's anchor blood would grant him access to the emotional control that had made Kieran legendary among their kind, and Luna's even stronger genetic markers would provide him with a renewable source of that power. He would become the new king of vampires, ruling through a combination of supernatural strength and the strategic brilliance that Anchor Blood could provide. As visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythms, Marcus made his move. He entered Luna's room with the confident stride of a medical professional, carrying a syringe filled with sedatives that would incapacitate the child without harming her valuable bloodline. But Luna looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes and began to hum her protective lullaby, and suddenly Marcus found himself remembering things he had spent centuries trying to forget. The melody cut through his vampiric conditioning like a blade through silk, forcing him to recall the human emotions he had abandoned when he embraced immortal hunger. For a moment, he wavered on the threshold, his supernatural confidence shattered by a 6-year-old girl's unconscious use of anchor power. But centuries of accumulated malice reasserted themselves, and Marcus realized that Luna's abilities made her even more valuable than he had originally calculated. He moved with vampiric speed, grabbing the child before she could cry out and pressing the syringe to her neck. Luna's song cut off mid-note, replaced by a silence that seemed to echo through the hospital's corridors like a scream. In his surveillance center, Kieran felt that silence like a physical blow, his supernatural senses screaming warnings as Luna's protective melody vanished from the world. He abandoned all pretense of caution and raced toward the hospital, his enhanced speed carrying him through the city streets faster than any mortal vehicle could manage. Behind him, emergency lights began to flicker as his emotional state destabilized the electrical grid, and ahead of him, the hospital's power systems fluctuated wildly as Marcus revealed his true nature. Dr. Cross was reviewing Elena's charts when every monitor in the pediatric unit began displaying impossible readings. Heart rates spiked beyond survivable levels before dropping to flatline, oxygen sensors registered vacuum conditions in rooms filled with breathing patients, and temperature readings fluctuated between Arctic cold and furnace heat with no corresponding environmental changes. She ran toward Luna's room and found it empty except for a message written in what looked like blood on the white hospital wall. Marcus Voss had Luna, and he was willing to trade her life for Elena's location and Kieran's promise to stand down. The hospital's emergency systems failed completely as supernatural forces clashed in spaces designed for healing rather than warfare. Detective Reed's radio crackled with reports of citywide power fluctuations centered on the medical district, and Dr. Cross found herself standing in the middle of a reality that her medical training had never prepared her to understand. Somewhere in the darkness between the hospital's floors, a vampire lord held a child hostage, while ancient powers stirred to life, and the careful balance between the mortal and supernatural worlds began to collapse. The hospital's basement level existed in perpetual fluorescent twilight, a maze of storage rooms and mechanical spaces that hummed with the constant sound of ventilation systems and backup generators. It was here that Marcus Voss had chosen to make his stand, dragging Luna's unconscious form through service corridors while the building's electronic systems screamed warnings that no mortal ear could interpret. He had positioned himself in the central utility room, surrounded by the hospital's vital infrastructure, knowing that any battle fought here would risk the lives of every patient on the floors above. It was the perfect psychological trap for someone like Kieran, whose protective instincts had already compromised his strategic thinking beyond repair. Marcus held Luna against his chest with one arm, while his other hand gripped a blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its obsidian surface carved with symbols that predated human civilization. The weapon had been forged in the early days of vampire history, designed specifically to kill immortal creatures who had grown too powerful for conventional means of execution. It was a relic of the Council's justice, and Marcus had stolen it from their most sacred vaults for this exact moment. When Kieran materialized in the utility room like shadow-given substance, the sight of Luna's pale face and Marcus's supernatural blade sent rage coursing through his immortal frame with intensity that made the air itself crackle with electric potential. For 3 centuries, he had maintained perfect emotional control, But now every circuit breaker in the hospital's electrical system blew simultaneously as his fury overwhelmed the careful barriers he had constructed around his power. Emergency lighting flickered to life as the main power grid failed, painting the utility room in hellish red illumination that turned Marcus's grin into something demonic. The rival vampire lord had expected anger, had counted on it to make Kieran reckless, but he had not anticipated the sheer magnitude of power that emotional investment could unleash in someone who had spent centuries learning to contain it. Marcus spoke with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages, explaining how he had tracked Seraphina's bloodline for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to claim what should have been his by right of strength. He had known about Elena's heritage before Kieran had discovered it, had been watching the family and waiting for the child to manifest the abilities that made Anchor blood so valuable. Luna was not just descended from someone with supernatural potential, she was the once-in-a-generation emergence of a siren bloodline, capable of commanding vampire emotions through song in ways that could reshape the balance of power in their world. The lullaby she sang was not just protective, but actively controlling, and in the right hands it could build or destroy vampire kingdoms. Marcus revealed his true ambitions as he pressed the obsidian blade closer to Luna's throat. He intended to drain both mother and daughter, taking their blood and their power for himself, but he also planned to keep Luna alive long enough to learn the full extent of her abilities. A siren in captivity could be trained, molded, turned into a weapon that would make him the most powerful vampire lord in centuries. He offered Kieran a choice that was no choice at all: stand down and watch the bloodline be consumed, or fight and risk Luna's death in the crossfire. The child stirred against Marcus's chest as the sound of their voices penetrated the sedatives in her system, her dark eyes fluttering open to take in the scene with supernatural clarity that no 6-year-old should possess. Luna saw Kieran standing in the emergency lighting like an avenging angel carved from darkness and desperation, saw Marcus holding the blade that seemed to drink light and hope in equal measure, and understood instinctively that this moment would determine whether her mother lived or died. Without conscious thought, she began to sing. The lullaby that flowed from Luna's throat was different from any version Kieran had heard before. Where Seraphina's melody had been gentle and protective, Luna's carried the accumulated power of all the women in their bloodline who had sung it down through the generations. It was not just a song, but a command, woven from notes that resonated with frequencies older than language, designed to reach into the souls of supernatural creatures and remind them of their lost humanity with overwhelming force. Marcus's grip on the obsidian blade wavered as the melody hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it emotions he had buried for over 2 centuries. Suddenly he could feel every death he had caused, every innocent life he had snuffed out in his quest for power, every moment of love and kindness he had rejected in favor of immortal hunger. The weight of his accumulated sins crashed down on him with intensity that made his supernatural strength meaningless, and for the first time since his turning, Marcus Voss remembered what it felt like to experience genuine remorse. The vampire lord staggered backward as Luna's song continued, her young voice carrying power that seemed to grow stronger with every note. She was not just compelling him to feel emotion, but forcing him to experience the full weight of his existence from the perspective of his victims, to understand the magnitude of suffering he had caused across 2 centuries of predatory existence. The obsidian blade fell from nerveless fingers as Marcus clutched his head, overwhelmed by the sudden return of empathy he had thought permanently destroyed. Kieran moved with speed that turned him into a blur of motion, crossing the utility room before Marcus could recover his composure or his weapon. The 2 vampire lords collided with force that sent shockwaves through the hospital's foundation, their supernatural strength turning the confined space into a demolition zone as they fought among pipes and electrical conduits that sparked and screamed under the impact of their battle. Marcus fought with the desperation of someone who had gambled everything on a single moment and seen it slip away, but his emotional turmoil made him clumsy, unpredictable in ways that worked against him, rather than providing tactical advantage. Kieran pressed his attack with 3 centuries of accumulated skill and the focused fury of someone who had found love again, only to see it threatened by creatures who understood nothing but hunger and dominance. The battle raged through the utility room and out into the service corridors, both vampires moving faster than mortal eyes could follow, while Luna's song echoed through the hospital's infrastructure like a supernatural fire alarm. Dr. Cross heard the melody through the building's ventilation system and felt her heart respond to notes that carried comfort and terror in equal measure, while Detective Reed's radio crackled with reports of seismic activity centered on the medical district. Above them, Elena stirred in her hospital bed as her daughter's voice reached her through whatever realm her consciousness inhabited, and for the first time in days, her vital signs began to stabilize. The confrontation ended when Marcus, driven to desperate fury by emotions he couldn't process or control, made the fatal mistake of lunging for Luna instead of pressing his attack against Kieran. The Vampire King intercepted him with perfect timing, driving his hand through Marcus's chest and grasping the heart that had not beaten for 2 centuries. The rival lord's eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been gratitude as Kieran crushed the organ that had sustained his immortal existence, ending a reign of terror that had lasted far too long. But Marcus's final act was to activate a blood curse he had prepared as insurance, channeling the last of his supernatural power into a strike that found its way past Kieran's defenses and opened wounds that no amount of vampiric healing could repair. As Marcus Voss crumbled to dust and memory, Kieran collapsed against the utility room wall, his immortal strength bleeding away through injuries that reached deeper than flesh and bone. Luna crawled to his side with the fearless determination that had characterized her throughout the crisis, her small hands reaching out to touch the face of the Vampire King who had sacrificed everything to save her family. She whispered that she was sorry he was hurt, that she knew he was a good person even though he looked scary, and that she would remember him forever in the special song her mommy had taught her. Kieran smiled at her words, feeling lighter than he had in 3 centuries as the weight of immortal existence finally began to lift from his shoulders. Dr. Cross found them there 10 minutes later, drawn by Luna's renewed singing and the strange silence that had fallen over the hospital's electrical systems. She saw a child comforting a dying man in expensive clothes, surrounded by the wreckage of what looked like an industrial accident, but felt like something far more significant. The security cameras had recorded nothing, their memory banks mysteriously wiped clean during the power fluctuations, and when Detective Reed arrived to investigate the disturbance, he found only Luna humming her lullaby, while Dr. Cross worked frantically over a patient whose injuries defied medical explanation. Kieran used the last of his fading strength to reach Elena's room, guided by Luna's small hand and Dr. Cross's bewildered assistance. The Vampire King, who had ruled from shadows for 300 years, approached the bed where his beloved's descendant lay dying, and without hesitation or regret, he opened his wrist and let his immortal blood flow into her mouth. The act of complete sacrifice, given freely and without expectation of return, broke the supernatural poison's hold on Elena's system like dawn breaking an endless night. As his life force flowed into her, Kieran felt Seraphina's presence one final time, her spirit welcoming him home to a rest he had not known he needed. Elena's eyes opened as Kieran's closed forever, and Luna's lullaby continued to echo through the halls of Mercy General Hospital, carrying with it the memory of love that had transcended death itself. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows with the gentle warmth of early autumn, painting Elena Ashworth's face in golden light as consciousness slowly returned to her for the first time in 5 days. Her eyes fluttered open to find Luna curled up in the bedside chair, humming softly while she colored in a book that Dr. Cross had brought from the hospital's children's collection. The melody was familiar and comforting, Though Elena couldn't quite place where she had heard it before, and the peaceful expression on her daughter's face suggested that whatever crisis had landed them in the hospital was finally over. Elena's throat felt dry as desert sand when she tried to speak, but Luna looked up immediately at the sound of her mother's movement, her dark eyes bright with relief, and something that might have been ancient wisdom in someone so young. Dr. Cross appeared moments later, summoned by some maternal instinct that seemed to transcend medical training, and her professional smile couldn't quite hide the profound relief that flooded her features when she saw Elena sitting up and responsive. The pediatric physician had seen many recoveries during her 20-year career, but none that had felt quite so much like witnessing a resurrection. Elena's memories of the past week existed in fragments that felt more like dreams than reality, impressions of darkness and fear punctuated by moments of inexplicable comfort. She remembered falling asleep after putting Luna to bed and waking up in the hospital with no clear recollection of what had happened in between. Dr. Cross explained that she had suffered from what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction to an unknown substance, something that had caused systemic organ failure before the medical team was able to identify and counteract the toxin. The explanation felt incomplete somehow, but Elena was too grateful to be alive and reunited with her daughter to question the details that didn't quite add up. Luna chattered happily about the nice doctor who had taken care of them, about the special songs she had learned during their hospital stay, and about the sad man in the dark coat who had visited her dreams to tell her stories about brave princesses and protective magic. Elena listened with the indulgent attention that mothers reserved for their children's elaborate fantasies, not noticing the way Dr. Cross's expression tightened slightly at Luna's casual mention of the mysterious visitor. When Elena asked about the dreams, Luna replied with the matter-of-fact honesty that made adults alternately charmed and unsettled. She described conversations with someone who looked like the pictures in old storybooks, who had explained that sometimes people had to make very hard choices to protect the people they loved most, and who had promised that her mommy would be safe as long as Luna remembered the special song he had taught her. Elena assumed her daughter was processing trauma through the lens of childhood imagination. But Dr. Cross recognized something in Luna's account that suggested the child's dreams had been far more significant than anyone could prove or explain. Over the following days, Elena's recovery progressed with a speed that impressed even the medical team accustomed to the resilience of human physiology. Her blood work returned to normal ranges, her energy levels rebounded to match those of someone half her age, and the mysterious puncture wounds on her neck healed without leaving so much as a scar to mark their existence. Dr. Cross monitored them both with the dedication of someone whose professional interest had become deeply personal, though she never quite articulated why she felt such strong protective instincts toward a family she had only just met. Elena returned to her 3 part-time jobs with renewed vigor, as if her brush with death had reminded her of life's precious fragility. Luna went back to school with stories that her teachers dismissed as particularly creative fantasy play, tales of hospital adventures involving mysterious helpers and magical songs that could make sad people feel better. The child's supernatural awareness gradually settled into the background of her consciousness, manifesting as an unusually strong intuition about people's emotional states and an uncanny ability to comfort others simply by humming melodies that seemed to reach directly into their hearts. Dr. Cross found herself becoming a regular part of their lives, initially under the pretense of monitoring Elena for any delayed reactions to her mysterious condition, but eventually simply because the small family felt like something she had been missing without knowing it. Meanwhile, in dimensions that existed parallel to mortal reality, the Vampire Council convened for the final time in a matter that had already concluded itself beyond their ability to influence or control. The obsidian chamber resonated with frustration and grudging respect as the 12 ancient lords reviewed evidence of Kieran Blackthorn's final actions. Their enforcement team had arrived at the hospital hours too late, finding only a small pile of ash in the utility room and the lingering resonance of power that had been willingly sacrificed rather than conquered. The eldest council member spoke with the gravity that 3 millennia of vampire politics had taught him was necessary for moments that would reshape their understanding of immortal nature. Kieran's sacrifice had been witnessed by mortal allies whose discretion could be trusted, had eliminated a rogue vampire lord whose actions threatened their carefully maintained secrecy, and had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that transcended even their ancient expectations. The human family had been left unharmed and unaware, their supernatural encounter disguised as medical emergency, with no loose ends that could expose vampire society to broader human attention. Most importantly, the anchor bloodline remained intact and protected, its power now dormant but potentially available if future crises required intervention from someone with Seraphina's unique gifts. The council's judgment was unanimous, if reluctantly given. Kieran Blackthorne had ended his existence with honor, his final act proving that emotional attachment could strengthen rather than weaken a vampire lord when properly channeled toward protective rather than possessive ends. The human family would be left in peace, monitored from a distance, but never approached or threatened by vampire politics. Luna's emergence as a potential siren would be noted in their records, but not acted upon unless she herself chose to seek contact with supernatural forces. The Blackthorn line was declared closed with distinction, and any vampire who threatened Elena or Luna would face the full wrath of council justice. Detective James Reed spent another week investigating power fluctuations and equipment malfunctions that seemed to center around the medical district. But his inquiries led only to technical explanations about grid instabilities and electromagnetic interference from hospital equipment. The security footage that might have provided answers had been thoroughly corrupted, showing nothing more interesting than routine medical procedures and visiting hours. Reed's instincts continued to insist that he was missing something significant, but without evidence that would hold up in court or testimony from witnesses who could describe anything beyond normal hospital operations, he eventually closed his case as resolved through medical intervention. The detective never quite forgot the feeling that something momentous had happened just outside his ability to perceive or understand it, but he also never found concrete proof that would have allowed him to pursue the matter further. Dr. Cross made subtle arrangements to ensure that Elena's medical records would follow her wherever she moved, that Luna's school records would flag any unusual incidents that might suggest renewed supernatural attention, and that both mother and daughter would have immediate access to specialized medical care if they ever again showed signs of unexplained illness. She never explained these precautions to Elena, presenting them instead as routine follow-up care for someone who had experienced such a severe allergic reaction. In quiet moments, Dr. Cross sometimes wondered about the man whose body she had found beside Luna in the hospital's utility room, whose injuries had been far too severe for the sterile environment where he had somehow appeared. She remembered the way Luna had held his hand while humming her lullaby, the peaceful expression on his face, despite wounds that should have caused agony, and the sense that she was witnessing something far more significant than medical emergency. But without context for understanding what she had seen, Dr. Cross filed the memory away as one of those inexplicable moments that occasionally punctuated medical careers, focusing instead on the tangible reality of two lives that had been saved through intervention she couldn't fully explain. Elena began having dreams that felt more like memories than imagination, visions of a love so profound that it could transcend death itself, and protect generations of descendants through pure force of will. She woke from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and a sense of gratitude towards someone she couldn't name, someone who had sacrificed everything to ensure that she and Luna could continue their simple, precious life together. Luna continued to sing her lullabies, the melodies growing richer and more complex as she unconsciously incorporated harmonies that carried the accumulated wisdom of all the women in her bloodline who had used music to heal and protect. The songs she hummed while playing or doing homework carried enough residual power to calm aggressive dogs, soothe crying babies, and bring moments of unexpected peace to anyone lucky enough to hear them. As autumn settled into winter and the supernatural crisis faded into the kind of half-remembered trauma that time gradually transforms into family legend, Elena and Luna rebuilt their lives with the resilience that had characterized their bloodline for generations. They were protected now by sacrifice made from love rather than duty, watched over by forces that asked nothing in return except that they live fully and well. The sad man in Luna's stories gradually became just that, a story, though she never forgot the melody he had taught her or the promise she had made to remember him in her songs. In the space between mortal and immortal worlds, where love could anchor souls and sacrifice could purchase safety, Kieran Blackthorne's choice echoed forward through time, ensuring that Seraphina's bloodline would continue to carry light into a world that too often forgot the power of selfless protection. 6 months had passed since Elena Ashworth left the hospital with her daughter and a clean bill of health that still felt like a miracle to everyone involved, though none of them could quite explain why. Spring had arrived early that year, filling their small apartment with light that seemed to carry its own warmth beyond what the pale March sun should have been able to provide. Elena found herself humming while she cooked breakfast, a melody that felt both familiar and mysterious, as if she were remembering a song from a dream that had left everything but the music behind. Luna would often join in with harmonies that a 6-year-old shouldn't have known, but sang with such natural ease that Elena never questioned where her daughter had learned them. The apartment itself had become a haven in ways that went beyond the simple comfort of home. Neighbors who had once complained about noise or late rent payments now spoke to Elena with gentle consideration, offering help with groceries or babysitting without being asked. The building's chronic problems with heating and electrical issues had mysteriously resolved themselves, and even the most persistent urban pests seemed to avoid their floor entirely. Dr. Cross visited every few weeks under the pretense of routine follow-up care, but Elena had begun to suspect that the pediatric physician's concern had evolved into something deeper than professional obligation. The doctor would sit in their kitchen drinking tea and watching Luna play with an expression that suggested she was witnessing something precious and fragile that required active protection. When Elena asked about it, Dr. Cross would deflect with gentle humor, but her eyes held secrets that she seemed determined to guard as carefully as she guarded her patients. Luna had returned to school with stories that her teachers initially dismissed as creative fantasy, but gradually came to respect as something more meaningful than simple imagination. She spoke of the sad man in the dark coat as if he were a character from a favorite book, someone who had taught her important lessons about love and sacrifice during the time her mother was sick. Her classmates loved hearing Luna's stories during circle time, especially the parts about magical songs that could heal hearts and protect families from dangers they never knew existed. The lullabies Luna sang during quiet activities had a remarkable effect on classroom behavior, somehow managing to calm even the most energetic children without appearing to be anything more than a pretty melody hummed by a thoughtful little girl. Elena's own recovery had been remarkable in ways that her medical teams struggled to explain. Not only had she returned to full health, but she seemed to possess energy and resilience that exceeded her baseline from before the mysterious illness. Her 3 part-time jobs felt less exhausting than they used to, and she found herself able to be more present and patient with Luna despite the demands of their still precarious financial situation. Sometimes Elena would catch herself staring out their apartment window as if she were waiting for someone, though she could never explain who or why. The sensation was accompanied by a warmth that felt like being watched over by someone who cared deeply about their welfare, and while it should have felt intrusive, it instead brought comfort that made their small apartment feel safer than any fortress. Dr. Cross had made subtle arrangements that Elena was only beginning to understand. Their medical insurance had been mysteriously upgraded to cover treatments that should have been beyond their financial reach. Luna's school had received an anonymous donation, that ensured she would have access to enrichment programs that nurtured her obvious musical talents, and Elena had been offered a part-time position at the hospital that would provide better benefits while allowing her to maintain the flexible schedule that single motherhood required. When Elena asked Dr. Cross about these apparent coincidences, the physician would smile and mention the charitable nature of certain private foundations that preferred to remain anonymous. The truth was more complex than Elena could have imagined, rooted in supernatural forces that existed just beyond the edge of mortal perception, the space between dimensions where spirits could choose their form of existence. Kieran Blackthorne had discovered that true love could indeed conquer death, though not in the way romantic stories typically portrayed such victory. His sacrifice had not destroyed him, but transformed him, burning away the hunger and isolation that had defined his vampiric existence, and leaving behind only the protective devotion that had driven him to give his life for Elena and Luna's safety. He existed now as something between ghost and guardian angel, bound to Seraphina's bloodline through the lullaby that carried the essence of their eternal connection. When Luna sang, Kieran could feel her presence across the veil that separated life from death, and through that connection he maintained his vigil over the family he had died to protect. The apartment where Elena and Luna lived had been consecrated by his sacrifice, warded against supernatural threats by power that flowed from love given freely rather than duty imposed by law. No vampire or other supernatural predator could approach their home with harmful intent, and the protection extended to anywhere the lullaby was sung with genuine love and understanding of its deeper meaning. Luna had grown into her supernatural awareness with the gradual acceptance that characterized childhood adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. She understood that her songs carried special power, that the melodies her mother hummed unconsciously were part of something larger than entertainment or comfort. Sometimes, when she sang the lullaby that had saved them all, Luna could sense a presence nearby that felt familiar and protective, like the memory of being held by someone who would never let harm come to her. She never spoke of this sensation to adults, understanding instinctively that it was private and precious, something to be treasured rather than analyzed. Elena had begun teaching Luna more complex versions of the melody, harmonies that seemed to emerge from genetic memory rather than formal musical education. Mother and daughter would sit together in the evening light that streamed through their apartment windows, their voices blending in songs that carried power beyond their understanding but within their natural ability to channel. During these sessions, Elena sometimes felt as though someone else were listening, someone whose presence brought peace rather than concern. She attributed the sensation to her imagination, but the feeling was too consistent and comforting to dismiss entirely. Dr. Cross had become the closest thing to extended family that Elena and Luna had ever known, though her protective instincts remained rooted in knowledge she couldn't fully share. The pediatric physician had researched everything she could find about the supernatural elements she had witnessed during Elena's crisis, enough to understand that they had been caught in something far larger than medical emergency. Her commitment to watching over them came from both professional obligation and personal affection, but also from a growing awareness that Luna represented something rare and valuable that deserved protection from forces that ordinary people couldn't comprehend or combat. On quiet evenings when Dr. Cross joined them for dinner, the three of them would sometimes sing together, their combined voices creating harmonies that seemed to fill their small apartment with light that had nothing to do with the electric fixtures. During these moments, Elena would feel completely at peace in a way that suggested their little family was exactly where it was meant to be, protected by love that had found a way to transcend every barrier that mortality could present. Luna had begun teaching the lullaby to other children at school, sharing the melody with friends who were sad or scared, or simply in need of comfort. Her music teacher had noticed the way Luna's singing seemed to calm the entire class and had begun incorporating her lullabies into group activities, though she never fully understood why certain songs had such a profound effect on young minds. Through Luna's sharing, The protective power of the melody began to spread beyond their immediate family, creating ripples of peace and safety that touched other children who needed the kind of protection that only love could provide. As spring deepened towards summer, Elena found herself humming the lullaby while she worked, the melody becoming as natural as breathing and twice as necessary for her sense of well-being. She had stopped questioning where the song had come from or why it felt so essential to their daily routine, accepting it instead as one of those gifts that life occasionally provided without explanation or condition. Luna's version of the melody had evolved to include new verses that seemed to emerge spontaneously from her imagination, though Elena suspected that her daughter was somehow channeling knowledge that came from sources beyond conscious memory. One evening, as Elena and Luna sat together in the golden light that slanted through their apartment window, both of them singing the lullaby that had become their family's most treasured tradition, Luna looked up with the solemn expression that sometimes appeared when she was processing thoughts too complex for her age. She told her mother that the sad man from her dreams was happy now, that he had found the peace he had been looking for, and that they would always be safe as long as they remembered the special song he had taught them. Elena listened with the patient attention that mothers reserve for their children's most important revelations, not fully understanding but recognizing the deep contentment in Luna's voice. As they finished the lullaby together, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to echo beyond the walls of their small apartment, Elena caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection on their window. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw the silhouette of a tall figure in a dark coat, standing in the twilight just at the edge of vision. The shadow seemed to nod once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell, before fading into the growing darkness like a promise that had been kept and a duty that had been fulfilled. Luna saw him too, and waved goodbye with the unself-conscious affection of a child who understood that some protectors watched from distances that couldn't be measured in physical space, but could be bridged by love and music, and the kind of sacrifice that transformed grief into eternal guardianship. The lullaby that had once carried sorrow across 3 centuries had become something new, a bridge between worlds that allowed love to flow freely between the living and the dead, ensuring that Serafina's bloodline would never again face darkness alone.